Welcome to Sarter TV. I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Our studio guest is Stephen Goldbach, Principal and Chief Strategy Officer at Deloitte, where he advises clients from a multitude of industries, from healthcare to media. He's also an author and is here to discuss his explosive new book, Detonate, Why and How Corporations Must Blow Up Best Practices to Survive. Stephen, thanks for dropping by.
Thanks for having me, Tracy.
So before we delve into your new book, let's talk about your role at Deloitte as Chief Strategy Officer.
So as Chief Strategy Officer, I am responsible for helping our executive team chart our course for how we want to serve our clients well, how we want to win against our competition, and the choices we make across all of our businesses in the U.S., our audit, tax, risk and financial advisory, and our consulting business.
So your brand new book, Detonate, as we say, has quite a sense of urgency to it. So is that why you gave it such an explosive title? Talk about that.
It's interesting, Tracy, because the title was actually our second choice. So the first choice for the title was The Delusional Organization. And we went to our publisher and we said, we'd like to do this book about organizations trying to convince themselves that many of their practices are in fact continue to be value creating, and our publisher gave us some feedback and said, we're not so sure that negatively titled books sell all that well. People prefer more positive books. And so we went back and we thought about it some more, and we actually came up with Detonate. We said we like that even more, even though we know it's negative.
It's catchy though.
It's a little catchier, and we said, look, Detonate is not all that negative. Detonate is about targeting a blast. It's not just blowing everything up willy-nilly. It's about actually targeting something and putting something else in its place. So it's about a controlled explosion rather than, just an out-of-control explosion. So that's what we want companies to do, is to target the places within their organization that need change in response to what we see going on in the marketplace.
What's the primary purpose of the book?
Primary purpose of the book is to motivate people to think differently and act differently. And I know later on in the book we'll talk about the principles that drive that. But what we did not want to do was take a stance that says there are a bunch of playbooks that we think are outdated and outmoded in light of technological change that's going on in the world, and replace them with new playbooks. What we want to call to attention is executives needing to take a more first principles approach to leadership and to management, and take, as you talk about in your book, a learning approach to making sure that they're always curious about what's going to drive and motivate the behaviors of their customers and the behaviors of their people.
And who's the primary target audience for Detonate?
We think about if the prime prospect, sort of the most relevant, would be a senior executive who's responsible for change, or a leader within any organization of any degree of scale. So think, $1 million, $5 million in revenue or up. This really isn't targeted at startup organizations, because we think that they more naturally apply the principles of Detonate than do larger organizations. And we would say it can be useful, though, to not just the leaders, but the people inside the organizations trying to get out from the shackles of conventional wisdom and drive some change within their organization.
Explain the term that you use in your book, best practices, and why has this mindset persisted, do you think, for so long in the business world? What is it about this particular thing that people just want to hold on to?
Best practices is a term that's existed for a long time, where people take comfort in knowing that there are others that are doing the same thing. And we had the pleasure of working with a terrific cartoonist to bring some of the ideas to life, Tom Fishburne, in the book, who, one of the cartoons was a group of lemmings running towards a cliff unknowingly, and then one of the lemmings is saying to the other, "I'm glad we're all aligned." Best practice is a reflection of that mentality, where people take comfort in knowing that there are others that are doing the same thing around them, and that they can't be possibly doing something that would make them look stupid.
Stand out and did the
right.
Wrong thing.
Who would want to stand out from the herd? Mm-hmm. The problem with that concept, though, is by definite, like mathematically, if everybody in your industry is following best practices, then by definition you are all average. You are not best. And if you actually want to win in business, you have to choose to do some things different than others. We're not against the notion of best practices, but we think companies sort of slide into blindly following those best practices as if they're the only thing that you might do, as opposed to thinking, well, we could do something quite different.
So tell us, what are the 4 key principles companies have to leverage in order to achieve growth and transformation?
There are 4 principles to a Detonate mindset. The 4 principles are focus on human behavior. The second principle is bringing a beginner's mind. The third principle is making minimally viable moves. And the fourth is embracing impermanent. The first 2 are about thinking differently. The second 2 about acting differently. And so if you think about focusing on human behavior, any change that you want to make in the world, whether it's a change on your customer or a change to your organization, has to start with some human behaving differently. So they're doing something different than they were before. Either they're perhaps buying your product instead of buying a competitor's product, or it's one of your employees behaving differently than they were before, perhaps to change the culture. It's really critical to adopt a Detonate mindset that you understand the behavior that you're trying to change. So get really precise on what you're trying to drive, rather than just say what we're trying to do is grow sales or we're trying to grow revenue. That's too imprecise. What we want to prescribe is what are the customer's behavior that you're going to change that is going to cause your revenue to grow. And to do that in a world where we see technologies changing people's behavior. We see lots of infusion of new and varied competition. To figure out how you could be the cause of that change in behavior, often at times it takes bringing a beginner's mind. And there's a great quote from the world of Zen Buddhism that says, in the expert's mind, there are few possibilities. In the beginner's mind, there are many. And the idea there is that if all you know is what you're certain of, then you're unlikely to try new things that might change people's behavior. And that's a recipe for being disrupted. So we want to be bringing a beginner's mind. A good example of a company that did this not too long ago was Levi Strauss, when they hired an executive from a different industry, from the world of fast-moving consumer goods, Chip Bergh, to be their new chief executive officer. And at the time that he took the role, Chip was understood that there was some angst within the organization about bringing someone from outside the industry in, and his response was, make me an expert. And it was just a good way to promote, some outside-in thinking. And then the other 2 principles are make minimally viable moves, which means that you'll never know if something's going to work that's new to the world unless you try it, and figure out the smallest way to make that move that would cause the least risk.
Do people tend to go too big when they start taking, when they eventually jump off and say, all right, let's try something different, let's take this risk?
That's a great question, and I think that's been the cause of this thing that we see in the world of celebrating failure, right? When people take too big a risk and they waste more money than they needed to get the learning that they need. So we have no issue with doing things new where your hypothesis might be wrong. What we have an issue with is wasting more money than you need to, and then chalking it up to, well, we failed, and don't we all love to fail?
We've learned so much.
We don't love to fail. So a story from the book there is that while I was at Forbes, we sent out 1 million QCATs, and a QCAT was a little device that allowed the reader to scan a barcode on an ad that would take them to a web page that they could get more information, about that ad. That was a very interesting concept to test, and was one that was worthy of learning about. And as it turned out, the product wasn't a success because it wasn't wireless at the time, and as it turned out, we learned that people don't always read their Forbes magazine when tethered to their office desk. They might choose to read it in other settings. We could have had that same learning by sending the QCAT to 30 people and not spending the money in order to do that. So a minimally viable move would have worked well in that situation versus not. And then the fourth principle, the fourth Detonate principle, is to embrace impermanence. And here is just simply to say a lot of the reasons why we continue to pursue best practices is because we haven't changed long-standing organization systems and processes that reinforce those behaviors. But if we believe that the world's going to continue to change in the future, we can't erect new systems and processes that are so permanent that we wouldn't tear them down when they're irrelevant. And so it's really important to not do things that are so permanent in nature that you couldn't undo them or change them when you find out that they've served their purpose and they might no longer be relevant.
What are exponential technologies and how have they impacted the business landscape in general? And can you share a case study?
Sure. So exponential technologies, there are many, and that's a term that's been popularized by Singularity University, and they are technologies that start out with adoption rates that look a lot like a linear adoption rates, where you see sort of a flat curve. But as we know from mathematics, at some point there is a inflection point on an exponential curve, and you start to see the growth rate adopt very quickly. I think a good example of an exponential technology is 3D printing, where we've seen 3D printing has actually been around for quite a while, and now we're starting to see adoption rates increase dramatically as the cost of it is lowered, as people are figuring out alternative uses for it, and we're seeing the impact of that, where you can now, for example, where factories can, instead of ordering a new part and shutting down the factory, they can have a small 3D printer on hand to create that new part live in the shop, and that's the way it's being adopted in business. Interestingly, we were talking about kindergartens while we walked in. Almost every single school that I visited for my soon-to-be 5-year-old daughter has had a small 3D printer in the classroom, as they're all adopting makers movements into the scholastic environment to give kids a way to have hands-on learning and design.
Tinkering and learning.
Yes.
And not afraid to fail attitude either.
No, and it's a risk-taking. It's a bit of a risk-taking and seeing what impact I can have on the world. If I try something, what will happen, as opposed to proving and studying what will go and happen. Let's see if I can be the cause of that change.
How should companies leverage the ambition matrix that you talk about in part 1, and where does the balance of opportunity exist for most companies?
So similar to that knowable and unknowable, the ambition matrix, which was offered in an article in HBR by my co-author and another one of our partners at the time, talked about having core innovation, adjacent innovation, and transformative innovation. And that's really about the degree to which it's a departure from your existing business model. What they found at the time was that if you put roughly 70% of your investment into the core, 20 into adjacent, and 10 into transformational, then you could expect a good balanced return, where much of the return would come from the transformational because of the increased risk, but your cash flow would come from that investment in the core, and you'd be comfortable on balance. What we're seeing here is, because many business models are now challenged because of long-standing competitive advantages being disrupted by technologies, the balance that companies need to invest in is moving well beyond that 70-20-10, and possibly in some cases, where you need to invest much more disproportionately into the adjacent and the transformational space, because the relevancy of your core business is simply going away.
Why do organizations seem to miss the mark so often when it comes to managing the balance of opportunity?
Yeah, and so what we're seeing is companies, there's a concept in the book that we talk about known and unknowable opportunities. Known opportunities are things where you can go out and do very traditional research and ask someone how much would they pay for it, whether they'd buy this product or not, and they can give you a reliable answer because they're comfortable with that world. And as the story goes, so often that we wouldn't have had the Sony Walkman if someone had said, would you like to walk and listen to music at the same time? People say, well, why would I ever want to do that?
Who could ever do that?
Who would ever want to do that? And that's been sort of a famous example of the unknowable. And increasingly, we're looking at a world where the opportunities that face companies are more in that unknowable space, that consumers and potential customers actually can't answer whether or not they'd like something. So we just have to try them. And we need different methods to understand the potential for products and services and business models in that unknowable space than we do in the known space. The challenge is that what we tend to do is take what we're comfortable with in the known space and try to apply it to unknowable problems. And we increasingly get bad results when we do that. We need different techniques to figure out if we should do something different in the world that's never been done than we do if we're testing sort of a modest derivative of an existing product.
Tell us a little bit about this maker movement, and do companies really need to embrace this philosophy to become innovative? And share an example with us if you could.
So the maker movement is sort of a cultural phenomenon where it's like the blend of do-it-yourself, technology advances and sort of hacking all into one, where people are just getting comfortable trying to prototype new things, build upon existing solutions. And Square, for example, was launched as the output of one of these maker shops where they sort of played around with different components to the device that would plug into a smartphone to be able to scan a credit card reader. And part of the philosophy that we like is just this notion of tinkering. So consistent with making a minimally viable move is just playing around with an existing offer, an existing product, an existing service to see how you can make it better and see how the world can respond. So the notion we like is just let's test something new and put it out into the world and see whether customers behave in the way that we want them to behave or not. And we see some of the world's great companies consistently doing that. Like Amazon is constantly testing lots of new offers. So that's a philosophy. We also see this consistent with the principles that I know you're trying to create in learning. Is lots of schools are adopting makers movements in the classroom just to be able to give kids that hands-on, do-it-yourself, kind of play around with the world mentality to see how they could be the cause of change to the world.
And that used to be that whole tactile experience that the Montessoris used to teach, and
Yes.
I'm sure they still do, but that was their basis going back even before technology. They made their kids no computers, no anything, have to do tactile,
Yeah.
learn by doing, make mistakes.
And now
they
we're
were embracing that early on.
Exactly, and now we're seeing it play out in classrooms with robotics and making and programming and coding and all kinds of different forms of versions of makers movement.
Is your daughter learning coding yet?
Not yet, but it's funny you asked that question, Tracy, because I think one of the choices I wrestled with was whether or not to put her in Mandarin lessons, because I've always wanted to learn Mandarin myself, and I've tried over the years, and it's hard, as you know, for adults
right.
to learn new languages. And so, then I got to thinking, it's like, well, when she's an adult, and are we going to have technology that's powerful enough to do direct translation? And then ultimately we decided that we would do it because she would have the capability to be more empathetic when you can speak the language. But I said, if we want to be successful in the new world, have a high EQ, be able to be empathetic with what people need, and have that ethnographic skill, and then be able to code it into a technology solution. So those would be the two skills I'm looking to get for my daughter.
So why do most companies get it wrong when it comes to their financial plan, and can the zero-based budgeting principle actually help to improve their performance overall?
Yeah, so the biggest mindset challenge that I think most organizations have in doing a financial plan is that there's an implicit presumption that they have a right to revenue in the next year because they've got revenue this year. And so the way that most financial plans are created is they start with saying, well, what did we do in the prior year? What's the market growing like? What will our share be in that continuing growing market? And then what's our profit target? And then how much can we afford to spend in order to make that profit target given the revenue that we'd get? Of course, the world works in literally the opposite way. You spend money to create revenue, not, revenue magically grows on trees and then we just spend money so that we could have profit.
This goes on year after year in companies.
This goes on year after year, and we just presume until it doesn't work, right? And when it doesn't work, we get into the vicious cycle that we describe in the book, where we continue to challenge, we try to, comply more with best practices until we hit rock bottom. We think that financial planning can be done better by taking that zero-based approach that you say, and actually starting with human behavior. Starting by saying, what behavior do we want to cause in the marketplace? And what's the amount of money that we would need to spend to cause that behavior to take place. And then it's okay to have an economic hypothesis to say, well, what would be the result, our financial success? But because we tend to focus on the financial aspect of it, we tend to make up financial spreadsheets to conform to a view of the world that is based on the past as opposed to what we're trying to achieve in the world.
Now, do you think companies should actually do away with all of this financial planning and focus more on customer behavior to drive the results? And if so, do you have a case study that you can share with us?
So I don't think it's about doing away with financial planning. I think most companies would be entirely uncomfortable without having some procedures to understand what it is that they're spending. But I think we need to make it more about what we're trying to accomplish in the world versus having a budget that we set in November and then we rebudget again in March, where it's about it's about feeling in control. And so what we would say is have a clear hypothesis about what you're trying to do in the world. Figure out how much you need to spend to do that, because you can control what you spend, and then understand if that's having the desired revenue impact, and then what does that all add up to? Is that something that's where those costs are worth it? The challenge is when you're spending in a way that is not being monitored in the real world and sort of ground in history instead.
So what are the 5 things companies should incorporate when setting their strategy and planning their period goals?
Yeah, so in the book we make reference to a concept that was developed by Roger Martin and a number of his partners while he was at Monitor Group, which was the predecessor to Monitor Deloitte. And he talks about 5 choices of strategy, which is what's your winning aspiration, where to play, how to win, what capabilities you need, and what management systems you need. And these are the 5 choices of strategy that every company makes, whether they're making them consciously or not. Every company makes those choices. And what we would say is that the best way to create strategy is to make those choices in a way that are as coherent as possible across them. So oftentimes companies decide, a customer target that's the most attractive, either because it's a fast-growing segment or it's the largest segment, and then they figure out how we could win. You've got to make sure that you can make all those choices collectively. You've got to not just make one choice and then the other. You've got to make them all in a coherent way, and oftentimes companies try to make one and then figure out how to make the others.
Okay, so discuss with us the implications for companies that follow the data that you discuss in your book in order to make decisions rather than using the data to support the decision-making process.
Yeah, so one of the things in the book that we talk about is to some extent the folly of syndicated data. And what we see is that companies are heavily reliant on the use of third-party data to make really critical choices. And there's nothing wrong with incorporating third-party data. We don't want people to bury their heads in the sand to learning. But the challenge is that they inappropriately believe that third-party data is to some extent proprietary. So
everyone has access to it within the industry. So
correct. If everyone has access to the same third-party data, then they're all going to draw the same conclusions, and therefore you're all going to do the same things. And when every company does the same things and there's no differentiation, it's really the customer who wins, because competition will happen and margins will erode and prices will decline. And so what we would say is that figure out a way to build in some sort of proprietary data into your business model so that you have a better chance of getting an insight that your competition won't have. And if you are using third-party data, then at least be cognizant that everyone else has access to it, so you've got to adopt a choice that will more likely lead to being different in the marketplace.
Tell us about this phrase, beginner's mind, that you discuss throughout the book, and can you share an example of a company that was actually able to leverage this mindset successfully?
So beginner's mind, as I said before, is a concept from Zen Buddhism. And it's really, we see it I've talked a lot about children. We see it when they get exposed to new ideas. They ask questions in ways that adults don't say, because they don't have a predetermined frame on the world. And the reason we like that concept is simply because In order to create different solutions for the world, innovative solutions, you need to not look at your world in a way that you are boxed in. In fact, someone once said that the greater the certainty that someone has that an outcome is going to be the case, the further you should run away from that, because they're not seeing the different possibilities that might exist in the world. You know, a great example of a company that continues to employ a beginner's mind, and in fact their founder and leader says it all the time, is Amazon, with Jeff Bezos talking about the importance of a beginner's mind. And they just consistently, instead of looking for what industries they can play in, they're looking for what customer problems they can solve. They want to know how they can, you know, make it easier and take out the friction in buying processes, and therefore they're not constrained by, well, no one's ever done that in this industry before. Well, you know, there's a real dirty word in innovation, which I think is industry, because even the term industry sort of connotes that there is, these competitors are in it and these competitors aren't. And it's not surprising that the companies that only look within an industry will be blindsided by competition that comes from outside the walls of that conventional wisdom.
Tell us about the concept minimally viable moves, and why should organizations embrace this?
Yeah, so minimally viable moves are a extension of a concept that comes from the world of design, which is around a minimally viable product, where you figure out, and it's very consistent with the makers movement that we've talked about. It's where you take a prototype and you create something that's good enough to get a response from a customer. So what do you think of this idea? What do you think of this product? And what we've said in the book is that let's take that concept from the world of design and apply it to just how we run businesses. So instead of figuring out what we'll have to, and take budgets for example, what we're going to have to spend all of, you know, next year or all over the next 5 years, let's figure out a behavior that we want to change, and let's figure out what we would need to spend for the next month to see if we could cause that behavior to change. And it allows us to be much more facile in terms of learning about the world and looking at the way the world will respond. And the principle simply comes from, if the world is changing around you, applying what you once knew is not going to give you a reliable read on whether people will behave in the way they want to behave. So you have to put something out into the world for them to respond to. And you can't afford to spend a ton of money every time you want to learn and change something. So just tinker with it, put it out in the world fast, see how people respond, and then change.
So why is it so difficult for companies to embrace impermanence, and what steps can they take to avoid this internal stagnation that we seem to be seeing a lot of lately?
So let's talk about the concept of permanence and what that is. So think about every, you know, organizational structure, job title, the way in which people are rewarded, their incentive plans. All of that lead to some comfort in their role. And one of the things that we observed in the world was that even though it was very apparent that consumers were spending more time with digital media than with traditional media, the world of marketers were relatively slow to migrate their spend away from more traditional media. It sort of happened in a much more evolutionary way than the behavior. Why was that the case? Because there were organizations who were powerful. There were people whose job titles were literally the head of television buying. And so those people, when faced with a choice of themselves personally becoming irrelevant or not, would fight to the death to say, well, this is why those things are still relevant. And what we would like to accomplish is decoupling the value that any one person has in the organization with their specific job at the time. Because if jobs and people's structure and organizational structures are a little more fluid to adapt to the changing landscape, then we'll be more relevant. But we sort of cling to what we know because it's comfortable rather than trying something new. And the thing that we need to change is that doing the same thing is somehow not risky. Right? There's a mindset that says if we're doing the thing that we've always done, that's less risky than doing something new. but increasingly not changing is actually a very risky behavior. And what we need companies is to realize the balance of change, that it is risky, in fact, to not try new things.
In that industry, when you talk about they're afraid to switch over to digital, was there a leader of the pack that finally said, we need to make this change or we're going to get decimated? And did they all follow, like that herd mentality?
Yeah, it certainly does take some leadership, and we were. I was personally fortunate to be along one of the pioneers in changing the advertising agency model. So it's well documented in public that we were part of the change organization that Procter and Gamble. Or the change process that Procter & Gamble put in place in the mid-2000s when we were part of Monitor Group that Jim Stengel and Mark Pritchard led around changing the structure of agencies. And what they said is they wanted to create an agency team for Procter & Gamble that was much more likely to put the different capabilities of agencies together, and they weren't satisfied with what they were getting from the agency world in that regard. And they put out there something that required lots of change management, but eventually lots of companies started to employ similar tactics, and we saw the agencies do it. So it does usually take a leader like an organization like P&G to break out from the pack.
And a big difference in the airtime, well, the pricing, right? Was that another issue too?
Sure.
Because TV time was so drastically expensive versus advertising online?
And it still is to this day, and it's just a difference of how do you use it in the context of the overall plan for changing behavior. There still are great roles for, what we're not seeing is the complete obfuscation of television, because there's still no better medium to really engage in. There's very few that will give you an opportunity to reach as many people at once in a communal way, like you might in a Super Bowl advertisement. But what you would see is that there are now ways where the sort of the tail of that spend might be better spent somewhere else.
So how important is behavioral economics in driving growth and innovation for companies? And can you tell us about a successful case study of this being implemented and how it kind of aligns overall with the theme of your book?
Yeah, so behavioral economics, and I'd add the worlds of cognitive psychology and neuroscience, has revealed just more learning about the human brain in the last 5 to 10 years than the rest of human history. We now understand a lot more about how people make decisions, about the heuristics that people use when learning, how people learn, how they form memories, how they form habits. And because of that, we can now, marketers and people who are looking to change behavior now understand better tactics in order to change and adopt that behavior. So a very simple example of places where behavioral economics is being used is in the world of online pricing. So the prices that you get presented in many online environments is customized based on your behavior that you've exhibited before. A very simple example from behavioral economics is that people are much more comfortable choosing something that's in the middle. People are rarely comfortable choosing the lowest priced option, right? Think about how many times the lowest priced bottle of wine is chosen in a dinner, and people rarely choose the highest price option because people want to feel like they're getting a value. So oftentimes prices and offers are framed as being a comfortable middle. So think when we're sitting in New York City, you get out of a taxi, you're given a choice of how much you tip your driver. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the choices are now 20, 25, and 30.
There's no 15, 18, but right to 20, 25.
Right to 20, and that's meant to try to increase the tip that you give the driver from a conventional norm of 20 to 25 because people are comfortable in the middle.
Exactly. Okay, with so many companies falling out off of the S&P 500 in the last decade, do you think it's because of ossification and they were afraid to detonate from within that you talk about? And if so, how can companies make this leap of faith and adhere to the philosophies outlined in your book?
Yeah, I'd say part of it is to start with a mindset shift of what got us here isn't necessarily the thing that will take us forward. And if you accept that, you might need to reinvent your business model if it is failing to have the desired impact and you want to look outside the bounds of your traditional walls and you are curious about how you delight customers, and those are the preconditions to making it more likely that you'll remain relevant. One of the concepts that we introduce in the book is this question of whether or not, it's not necessarily about S&P 500 versus not, but it's do companies need to survive forever? Right? Could we see a new concept of a company, which is a pop-up company, which says we're going to pop up in like a store does at the holiday season to take advantage of a customer need that is going unmet, that will only exist for a period of time, and we're not going to spend money to continually reinvent ourselves. That would be a strategy to employ. Another strategy would be continuing to invest to reinvent yourself, and both we think we might see in the future. But to remain relevant, you can't just rely on all the things that got you here. You've got to continue to be relevant for your customers.
In Chapter 12, you use the following quote from one of your managing partners. He says, "The most powerful tool executives have to drive change is their questions." Explain how this mindset can help empower decision-making and growth in organizations, and can you share an example or a case study of this?
That quote is from Jonathan Goodman, the global managing partner for Monitor Deloitte, and a longtime friend and colleague and mentor of mine. And it's just such a simple statement. So we talked about this notion of why people behave the way they do. One of the biggest drivers of why people behave the way they do in organizations is what questions they get from their leaders. So if a leader asks a question, and it's a senior executive, not surprisingly, that causes a lot of people to go around and say, well, Sue asked this question, so we've got to start to respond. Let's put together a deck because Sue asked this question. Sue might have been thinking out loud, and just thinking about it, but that causes a lot of activity. So what we wanted to highlight was the fact that leaders have this incredible tool, which is if they want to get people to behave differently, ask different questions. And so if you want to bring a beginner's mind, if you want to make minimally viable moves, then ask questions which are consistent with eliciting that behavior. So instead of asking, how do we know this is going to work, which is a lot of the kinds of questions that you get in boardrooms, ask instead, how might we find out whether this would work, right? And you can already see in the way you ask the question, it's that the second one elicits more of a test. The first one causes that the person responding to figure out a way to prove something that's never existed, that it will work in advance of ever having tried it. And so we think it's an important question that leaders, or it's an important concept that leaders recognize the behavior that their questions cause and use them to promote the Detonate mindset.
In our evolving technical and disruptive world, are you hopeful that Fortune 1000 companies will be able to blow up their best practices and risk avoidance behavior?
I'm an optimist by nature. I believe that it's one of those things that we will eventually say that companies need to just get better at trying different things, and they are dipping their toes. We see lots of companies being very acquisitive into the startup world, and as a way to infuse learning in their organization. So I'm optimistic, but I do think the ones that figure out a way to promote learning in their organization, to be curious about their customers, to be curious about how they can cause change in the world, are going to be the ones that survive. And the ones that don't do this are going to be the ones where someone else is going to come in and serve the needs of their customers better, and they're going to find it very difficult to compete in the world.
So what's the overall message you hope business executives take away from your book, and sum up why they should ignite the fuse, so to speak?
The overall message that we want people to take away from the book is one of just try it out, right? Just go do something different, right? Don't try to figure out all the, don't run all the analysis to the ground and get all the PowerPoint perfect. No customer ever bought anything because of a PowerPoint deck. Just have a hypothesis and go try it out in the world and see what happens. That is the simple thing that you would take away. And try that in your core business, because the increasingly not trying something new will be riskier than sticking to the things that are tried and true. And so the message that we'd say is don't be afraid to try something in a small way, because the worst thing that happens is that you take that little bit of money and you've learned something from it. We don't even want to call that failure, because we don't want companies to be celebrating failure. We want them to be celebrating learning. And that's what I'd say. Go try something different.
Stephen, thanks for stopping by to talk about your new book.
Thanks very much, Tracy.
And that does it for this edition of Sartor TV. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new today. Until next time, I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Thanks for watching.